The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History of Feminist Women's History comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today is an author interview I'm so excited about. I got to talk with Nikki M. Taylor, who is a professor of history at Howard University. And her book, as soon as I saw the title of this book, I was like, ooh, what's this? And then I got to read it. I was like, oh, I have to have her on the podcast. So her book is a nonfiction book called Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance. So this is a book about enslaved women in the United States using lethal force, aka murder, as the ultimate form of resistance. In our conversation, when I was talking with Nikki, she was talking about how this kind of fills a gap in the overall research of just American history, of the history of enslaved people, because these women's stories have not been shared to this extent before. She's looking at legal records, just to see who these women were, how they committed these murders, what the results were. So as part of the book's description, I'll just read you what it says. Nikki M. Taylor expertly reveals how women killed for deeply personal instances of injustice committed by their owners. The stories presented, which span centuries and legal contexts, demonstrate that these acts of lethal force were carefully premeditated. Enslaved women planned how and when their enslavers would die, what weapons and accomplices were necessary, and how to evade capture in the aftermath. Original and compelling, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge presents a window into the lives and philosophies of enslaved women who had their own ideas about justice and how to achieve it. It's an incredible, just the research that Nikki has done is so fascinating. The book is put together in this really, I'm going to say, and we talked about this in the episode, she's written academic books before, but this one is much more aimed at the average everyday reader. You don't need to have studied history to read this book. It's very readable. it's almost, I would say, like, if you're a fan of even true crime sorts of things, this might be your vibe. Anyway, it was such a fascinating book. I was so thrilled to get to talk to her. So please enjoy this conversation with Nikki M. Taylor. Okay, so I'm joined today by Nikki M. Taylor, who's the author of the new book, Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, which, first of all, is a fantastic title, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But welcome, Nikki.
Thank you, Anne. It's so good to be with you and all of your listeners today.
So my first question for you about your book is, how did you, I don't know, I guess my first question is just, how did you come up with a concept to write this book?
Wow. Yeah. Well, as a student of history, I always wondered why, my professors and authors said that Black women didn't tend to resist, using force. And I said, well, I wonder why. And the reasons they gave me never really made sense to me. And in fact, as a Black woman, it really made us seem a little bit more passive than reality would allow me to really absorb. And so it allowed, I started digging and started finding more and more and more stories. And it just became, just my life's mission to bring this to readers, these stories.
And how did you go about finding from legal trial records, or what was your detective work like to try and find these women?
Yeah, they're very hard to find in the usual sources. And so most of these women are very visible, or I should say audible, their voices are there in the records of these local courts, usually in a particular court called Oyer and Terminer. And so I never knew about the existence of this particular court. And so finding all of these trial cases where the women actually speak was just fascinating, because if you know anything about Black women's history in the age of slavery, we have just very little information. We are hard pressed to recover their words and the words that they left. So they're right there in these trial records. And so it was a gold mine for me as a historian of Black women's history.
The way that you've arranged the book, you kind of go sort of one person or one situation, one case at a time. But what unites all of them is a phrase that you use a lot in the book, and I was hoping you could define that for everyone, which is the Black feminist practice of justice. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, it's a new theory. And basically, as a scholar that has benefited from Black feminist theories in my life and in my career, I understood that in order to really amplify and make these women's lives more visible, I couldn't be tied to traditional historical methods and traditional historical interpretations. Because if you just look at these cases on the surface, Anne, you might conclude that these women were just irate and they were just angry and they were just impulsive. And so by having this other lens, I was able to see them more clearly. And so what I mean by a Black feminist practice of justice is derived from a Black feminist philosophy of justice. And so in order to say that, nobody ever talks about Black women as philosophers in the age of slavery, but it's philosopher in a more organic sense of the word. But this philosophy insists on fairness, decency, justness, and a basic expectation of humane treatment. It's rooted in Black women's lived experiences. It prioritizes their perspective, Anne. So it looks at history through their eyes. It looks at the world through their eyes. It also appreciates intersectionality, that it's impossible to understand the worlds they live without understanding them, not only as Black people, but as women, and as women with a particular status, an enslaved status. So all of those statuses, the race, gender, and enslavement, put them at a particular relationship to the government, to white people, and even to Black men. And so I talk about that in the book. Black feminist practice of justice also appreciates that at that time, the American justice system was pretty unfair, and knowingly so. A lot of the judges and attorneys knew that it was unfair. It was designed to be that way. There was a separate justice system for enslaved people. In addition, this Black feminist practice of justice really attributes rationality and forethought to these women's actions. It wasn't just impulsive, and I demonstrate to the readers the amount of planning that went into these murders of their owners. And I show in every case that it wasn't their first thing that they wanted to do. They tried other means of resistance before, other means that failed. And so this was their last best option to get some relief from the oppression or the abuse or the indignity that they were suffering. And the last element of the Black feminist practice of justice is that it kind of considers this idea of proportionality, right? So some people, if they didn't understand Black feminist theory or they didn't understand this particular theory, they might say, oh, well, these women, this is disproportionate to whatever injury their owner did to them. They killed these children, so this is not fair. It's not just. And so I say that this theory considers complicity and privilege. And so even white children had a level of privilege just by being the children of slaveholders that gave them a great deal of power over these women. And so I just reveal, all of that. And that is how I derived this theory. And so instead of looking at these women as the angry Black woman trope that people might be, initially might think that this was, you just have to be more, intellectual and thoughtful about their circumstances, put yourself in their position, and you'll arrive at a different conclusion about motivation.
Thank you so much for explaining that so well, because that's really the lens through which the whole book is told. It doesn't read at all. It's not like a true crime book about, oh, here's these women who kill these people. It's like, no, like you really looked at their life and their situation, what brought them to that point and why it was kind of inevitable for that. Like so they tried,
right.
Can you talk about the things that, I think there's some themes in several of the people you look at who tried before they ended up at murder, they tried to see if they could be sold to someone else. They tried to see, can you explain the other things that they would have tried first?
Yeah, so they've tried what all of us would try if we were met with an oppressive boss. They tried to skip out on work. They tried to talk back. They tried to maybe absent themselves from work or, lie about where they were, particularly in the case of Rose Butler. They even tried, sometimes they tried physical assault in the case of Lucy from Galveston. And sometimes they tried arson. Arson was a usual thing that they tried before murder because they thought their minds were, well, if I burn everything down, then my owner will be forced to sell me. And then I will get sold to a new owner, which is what they wanted. These women, Anne, were not trying to end slavery. And I really, stress that in my book. They just wanted to end their owners. So they just wanted to get away from these abusive owners. And so all of those things they tried first. And their last best option was murder. And they were fully aware of the consequences for that. It was not a surprise to any of them that they would be executed if found out.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book as well, basically, most of the people who you talk about do end up executed after. Like the reason we know that they did this is because they were caught. And then they're tried. And then, of course, they were found guilty. But you did mention also there's a period of time in which it was not, what was it? Female enslaved people wouldn't be executed. There's like a short period of time where because they just realized that like, oh no, this is reducing the slave population too much. We can't actually, it's a burden financially if we execute. So there's like a small window of time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so some of them were, especially in Virginia, the option was execution or transporting to another country or another state. So sometimes they did that. But, I don't know how common that was compared to execution. That's one thing somebody needs to do the research about that. But it just wasn't me for this book.
Well, that's the thing. I think you're doing so much original research here that it's really laying the groundwork, hopefully, for other people to follow up and get some more of these details and answer some questions.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted. And I have a full disclaimer. This is not exhaustive, right? I didn't go to every single courthouse in America. That's for a younger scholar to do and build their career on that. These are just case studies. So how I organize the book for your listeners, I have 7 case studies which reflect not only different times in history, different regions in history, but they're organized around different means of lethal resistance. So the first chapter is poison. That's how the women were able to get rid of their owner. The second chapter is a death by featherbed, of all things. The third chapter is water. Water is a murder weapon. The fourth is fire. The fifth is an axe, I believe. I'm trying to get them all straight. The 6 were picket fences, rails from a picket fence, and other assorted weapons. And then the 7th was maybe a hatchet. So that's kind of similar to the chapter 5, but a hatchet and physical force. So yeah, I try to represent all of these things in order to stress to the reader that these women were using regular household instruments. Everything within the house could be weaponized. And I thought that was really interesting because, I guess I've never thought about what could be used to kill somebody in the 18th century or the early 19th century. And these weapons were all carefully selected. And so I thought that was really interesting too. And so this is a pre-gun America, right? Where not many people had guns at their disposal. So it's hard for us to imagine that today. But it forces people to be a little bit more ingenious about how one would get rid of an oppressive owner.
Well, and I really want to emphasize just to the listeners what you were saying about the forethought that goes into these crimes. There's one instance where they were slowly poisoning a man for 6 years, I think.
Yeah. And the reason they wanted to do that is these women were just ingenious. They knew if they did it all at once, it would elicit suspicion. So if you do it slowly over time, then it would look like a regular illness that he was suffering from. And that's what people thought, that he just had a bad stomach or irritable bowel or whatever our modern medical analysis would be. And so people wouldn't have been immediately alerted to the fact that he was being poisoned were it not for what happened to his body when he died. And so that's how the coroner was like, wait a minute, this is not natural. This is not natural at all. And so that's how they were discovered, the coroner.
Well, and I think that's such a extreme example of the forethought. But yeah, like you were saying, it's not just someone who snapped and murdered somebody. These are all methodically considered plans.
Yes. And one of the pieces of evidence I had that it was methodical is that not only did they select accomplices, but they selected the time and date. They selected the means that they were going to use, like I said before. And most importantly, Anne, they all had an alternative plan of how they were going to get out of this. So either by, in this case that you mentioned, either pretending the guy or hoping that everybody thought the guy had a bad stomach, or by concocting this lie, this colossal lie about what actually happened in the house. And so that is something else that I thought was very rich. And it even becomes a little comical.
Can we talk about Rose Butler?
Yes. By far the most colorful of all.
Oh my goodness. So the very beginning of the Rose Butler chapter, you set up that this is going to be a real tale. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read just a sentence from your book. So in the ensuing months, Rose unraveled a complex plot that included a fortune teller, mysterious men in large brimmed hats, unpaid debts, death threats, and a letter hidden inside of a loaf of bread.
Yes. Yes. It's hilarious. I mean, she's absolutely hilarious.
Okay. I don't know. I don't think this is going to spoil the book necessarily, but can you just explain I love a colorful character from history, and Rose Butler just leapt off the page the way that you wrote about her. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
Yes, she did. In fact, she was the last chapter I added, and I told the story to my family, and they were like, you have to add Rose Butler. And my daughter in particular said, that woman will make the whole book. And I said, you're kidding. She said, Mom, you have to add Rose Butler. So at the last minute, I added her, but she came up with 4 different stories about an arson that she committed in her owner's home. And each time the story got more colorful. She talked about men in wide brimmed hats. She talked about other people passing her a letter inside a loaf of bread inside her cell in the jail. Because while she was in jail, the people's house was set on fire 2 more times. So it was clear she had accomplices. But who the accomplices were, they just got more and more colorful. They were, she gave different names. They lived around the corner. They were giving her money. At times, she said it was they were the ones that planned the arson. At other times, she said they forced her into planning the arson. At sometimes she said they are the ones that came and set the fire. And at other times, she said she set the fire. So it just was just so many colorful tales. And she acted up so bad in the jail where she was being held for almost a year that, the jail officials just didn't know what to do with her. She was irreverent. She was disrespectful to the ministers. And they had never seen anything like it, because at the time, this is in a time period where people expected women to behave a certain way in America and beyond, I'm sure in Canada as well. And so to have her cursing and disrespecting clergy and lying and doing all these things she was doing, they just had enough of Rose Butler. And she was, she just left her mark for those reasons. But that story is just, it's almost so colorful that it becomes a little comical, which I'm not trying to make history funny, but it certainly is interesting, Anne.
So I read your book and then I was just like, oh my gosh, I was telling my friends about the story of Rose Butler. And then I think it's here afterward, you mentioned like laughing with your family about the story. And I was like, okay, good. Like we can.
Right. She's hilarious. I mean, the stuff she came up with is just ingenious, but surely she had people who assisted her. But it's even her life before that arson was also very colorful, right? This woman is stealing money from her owners. She's taking party boats on the Hudson River. And this is in the age of slavery, party boats. And so she's buying people silk dresses. She's going to gambling joints. And she's telling her owners that she's going to Bible study. And so this is how she's having all of these nights to herself. So that is, I argue, is a type of resistance. All of that she's doing, she's trying to claim and assert a level of bodily autonomy, so she understands she is not free, but she makes herself as free as possible by using this lie of being in Bible study to then afford her the opportunity and the free time to do all these things that she really wants to do. On their dime, no doubt. Like the owners were not aware that she was using their gold coins and their money to do all of these things and to treat people to lavish meals and treats. So she was just quite a character.
And that's an extreme example of everything in your book, but just as an example of everything in the book really goes to just build up, because like you were saying, like in your own history scholarship, you had been told like, oh, the Black women didn't resist. They were just kind of passive, whatever. And that's very much the narrative that I've seen until I read your book as well, where you're really filling this in, showing these like really interesting people, like these characters. And like you said, hearing their own voice really, it just really fills in the gaps of that historical record, I think.
Well, thank you. That's what I wanted. And you know what else I wanted to do, Anne? I wanted to make, even though it's a grisly set of facts, right? And I want your readers to be fully aware what they're getting into. It's grisly. It's not for the faint at heart. But I also wanted to show their humanity, that they were human beings who had wishes and desires, and they weren't grand things. These women were not trying to start a revolution. They just wanted a revolution in their own circumstances. That's it. It doesn't seem like much to ask for, but and so I think I succeed as much as the historical records would allow me to, of just giving them some humanity. And I also try to give their owners some humanity. Most of them are poor white owners who own very few. So it's also very different from what we would assume would be the case of American slavery. These people were struggling as poor white slave owners that owned one or two or three enslaved people. And so all the way around, you understand the pressures that they were under, and also how that then made for a worse life for the enslaved people they owned.
And that's such a good point too. And I found that so interesting as well. I think almost maybe every example in your book is like a lower class family who owns very few enslaved people. So it's not the large plantations, it's not a Gone with the Wind scenario.
Yeah. And this is another opportunity for scholars who come after to explore that. Like, we have to move beyond these ideas that we all have, that slavery is cotton plantation in Mississippi. And so this is what it might have been like. This is probably what a revolution might have looked like on a farm in rural North America, right? And so that's another thing I try to, push scholars to try to look at that as well. Because, just because somebody's not on a big plantation doesn't mean they haven't found a way to resist slavery or, do a slave revolt. And I use revolt in air quotes because in this book, I've expanded the definition beyond what scholar Eugene Genovese did in his seminal work 60, 70 years ago. And so I'm hoping that people understand that slavery was bad regardless. So it was, that I think what people assume is that it was better on these smaller farms, that this was just better. They got to wear better clothes, they got better food, they got to sleep in a bed, which may have been true. But I don't know if one could say it was better, right? And so the book really lays that out. This was horrific for these people. And so it had to be for them to think that murder was their last best option.
I did also want to mention, I was sort of excited. There's just a brief mention in your book of Marie-Joseph Angelique, who is a woman in Canada. And I'm in Canada, and I knew a bit about her story. So I was excited to see you sort of tie her into that as well, because she allegedly set this fire that spread throughout much of Montreal.
Oh, yeah, she stands alone. I mean, no woman in America can touch even a thread of what she did in Canada. So she stands alone in North American slavery history. Okay, she stands alone. And the book that I used is the hanging of Angelique by Afuya Cooper. If anyone's interested in that, it's a brilliant book. And it was a template that I used for this one. Like, I'm a fan of hers, and that story was just phenomenal. You should read it, Anne. It's just a phenomenal story.
No, I will. I know a bit about her story, and I was visiting Montreal a while ago, and I was kind of like, "Ooh, this is where it was. This is where the fire happened." I was like, "Where's the statues? Where's the plaques?" I didn't find anything though.
Yes.
But I also wanted, at the very beginning of this chat, I mentioned your title. So you do Brooding Over Bloody Revenge is a quote from one of the women who you profile. So she said she had been brooding over her bloody revenge for some time. So, I mean, it's a great line. And it also speaks to the planning and the plotting that so many of these women did. How did you come to choose that as the title?
Right. When I read that story, it's in Jane Williams's chapter. It leapt from the pages. And I knew that had to be the title. And I kind of almost lost that title, Anne, because from a publisher standpoint, publishers tend to, sometimes they can change the title of your book. And so, and my daughter, she factors in again. She's a Gen Zer. She's like, Mom, nobody knows what brooding means. Nobody's going to know. That word is so old fashioned. And I heard her, but I said, okay, I still have to go with that. So I insisted on it, and I told the publisher, and the publisher was like, yeah, this matches, this works. People can Google the word if they want to know what it means. But so, I had to go against what Gen Z would have recommended, a representative of Gen Z, and went with that again, because not only in the title, but the subtitle of every chapter in this book, and I use words from the cases, if not from the women themselves. It's a subtitle of every single chapter. So it was important for me to have words from that case in my title. And that one leapt from the pages. I said, "Oh, this is spicy."
No, and I mean, the title caught my attention, certainly. But then when I read the quote in the book, I was like, oh, I see. This came from the testimony.
Yeah.
But you also have some quotes at the so you have at the beginning. I'm just looking at the book right now. So you have a quote from the people involved, and then also quotes from other people. So, for instance, this one, it stuck with me. So Simon R. Green's quote: "Revenge is simply justice with teeth."
Yeah. That's really powerful. So I liked that, and I think it really speaks to these cases as well. So yeah, I always use epigraphs, these quotes or poems at the beginning of chapters in all of my books. I found ones that are pretty relevant, considering what these women were actually committing themselves to do.
Again, just, when I came across the title of your book, I'm like, ooh, what's this about? I love a revenge narrative. I love, in fiction, but also in history. I like kind of cheering for somebody as they're coming up with the scheme. But so towards the end of the book, though, so you ask the question, did bringing one slave owner to justice disrupt slavery? And you say, yes. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, and the readers may disagree, and maybe the listeners as well. Once they read it, they may say, "I don't agree with her," but I think that, especially in these small rural towns and villages, which is where all these cases were, without exception, maybe only the Galveston one was maybe a little bigger of a city, but they disrupted the sense of peace in the towns where these enslavers lived. So to learn that somebody was successful in killing their owner just really sent the slaveholding or the enslaver community in a tizzy. And so they all wanted just brutal justice. And this is why you see such heinous and grisly executions where Black women are being burned alive, burned at the stake, because that's the only way to right this possibility that you might have somebody that tries it with their owner. And so, I think that kind of unsettled everybody. And if you know anything about the history of slavery in the U.S., the enslavers were perpetually concerned with revolt. They were perpetually concerned that they would be bludgeoned to death in their sleep. And so where do those ideas come from? Well, it comes from stories like this. This is how they get so unnerved and so fearful about what their enslaved people might do to them, is because there were actual cases where their enslaved people did bludgeon them in their sleep. So that's why I think, on some level, they were successful in disrupting the sense of peace. And not only that, Anne, in the case of Lucy in Galveston, that particular case, the people who owned Lucy after she killed the enslaver's wife, the husband, never again purchased another enslaved person. So, so it ended his maybe his history of being an enslaver. So I think that was powerful. So he never tried it again. And so so she was successful in that vein.
Yeah, well, and especially what you talk about in your books, that's what I'm thinking about, are in these sort of smaller situations where there's a family and they have just a few enslaved people. It's such an intimate living situation. Mm-hmm. Like, you have to have a level of trust. Like, these are the people cooking your food. These are the people watching your children. And when they, as one person does, kill two of your children, so there's a level of trust that has to be there. And when the trust is broken, that starts to disrupt the entire concept of slavery if you can't.
Right. And it disrupts, more importantly, in the sense of mastery. You can't master these people or dominate them fully, because every meal they bring to you, you have no idea what's in that meal. Every drink, in the case of Captain Codman in Charlestown, colonial Massachusetts, every drink, his tea infusions, his milk, his everything, they were dumping that arsenic into. And so, yeah, every part of your life, you're nervous. So it disrupts your sense of peace. And it might, think, well, maybe I don't have them inside my house, or maybe I just get out of the slaveholding business. We'll never know. But it certainly could mean that they would never have peace in their home as long as enslaved people were working inside their home.
And it also made me wonder, the research you're able to find about this is from these people who were caught and taken to trial, and then their statements and things. But I'm sure there are other people who were not caught, right?
Exactly. Yes, of course. Of course. And we'll never know. We'll never know how many of those there were. And so that's the thing. That's one of the things about history, is we have to have documentation to say that it's history and to say that it's a fact. But we know with all things, there's a possibility that the number of incidents like this could reach up to the hundreds or the thousands. We never know, because if they were successful in eluding suspicion or evading suspicion, then they don't make it into the history books.
Well, and especially like the slow poison over 6 years, like so many people died back then of various diseases. It wouldn't be that suspicious, especially if it was maybe an older person or someone who seemed already ill.
Exactly. So that was, I said, wow, we will just never know. And then conversely, for those who were accused of poisoning their owners, there were a lot of those who were accused of it and hanged and executed for it. But we know that the sanitary conditions were very poor at earlier moments in American history and world history. And so I gave one example: milk pasteurization, which happened in, the 19th century. And so when people died of illnesses after drinking milk before then, they're always accusing their enslaved people. But, possibly it could just be the fact that it was unpasteurized milk and it will kill you, So
your book is so interesting, and I'm really excited to see how other scholars, younger people who are just sort of building their careers, what they're able to find and how they can keep going with what you've started here.
And that's really what I hoped that people would do, is to take this and go out and do their own research. Like, it's not okay to continue that same old trope that, enslaved women just, they tended to resist covertly or quietly. That's not okay anymore. There's evidence. I've shown people how to go look for the evidence and where it might be. And we have to do this research. And so there has to be someone who's willing to make this their life's work. And so in 20 years, we can have a 300-page book that is exhaustive of all the incidents like this in American history. So I'm hoping that will happen.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. And thank you so much for writing this book that was just like, you did say it's, it's not easy reading in that way. The subject matter is very heavy, but you've written it in such a way that I was just glued to every page. I was just like, what's the next chapter going to even be about? When I got to Rose Butler, I was just like, oh my gosh. Like,
yeah, thank you so much. And it's okay. Like, I completely had so much fun writing it. And there are bits of comedy in every bit of the stories, right? Mostly because, of how I wrote it, not because the story itself is funny, but, just using their words and stuff like that. So it is an easy read for the listeners. And I really hope people will read it, because I think it gives you and offers so much while not bogging you down with traditional historical writing, which can be a little dull and inaccessible. So this is very accessible intentionally.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you.
So again, this book, which is so good and so interesting, it's called Brooding Over Bloody Revenge, Enslaved Women's Lethal Resistance. It's now available for purchase wherever you purchase your books from. There's a little link in the show notes if you want to buy it through bookshop.org using my link. And Nikki M. Taylor, she's a professor at Howard University. And I just want to say, so she specializes in 19th century African American history. Her subspecialties are in urban African American women and intellectual history. She is such a fabulous person. I really hope that I can find a reason to invite her back on this podcast again. We had such a good time talking to each other. And I can't recommend this book enough. It's so good. It's so interesting. And it's such a necessary new, like she was revealing stuff that hasn't been in books before, which is always so important and so interesting. Anyway, this is Vulgar History. My name is Ann Foster. You can find me wherever you are on the internet, really. We're on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. Now I'm on Threads at Vulgar History Pod. TikTok at Vulgar History, and you can get transcripts of recent episodes provided by Aveline Malik of The Wordery at vulgarhistory.com. I also have a Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. If you want to join there, you can get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History, as well as access to bonus episodes I put there. And also recently we have a Discord server, so you can go in there and hang out with other members of the Tits Out Brigade. Anyway, I hope you're all having a nice summer. And until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Lauro, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.